May these words be spoken and heard in the power of love. Amen. So we're in this period of weeks between Christmas and Ash Wednesday, a period we call in the church Epiphany. It started on January 6th, the Feast of the Three Kings, or the fabled 12th day of Christmas, and it will last through until the Sunday before Lent, which in this year will be February 14. So we can think of Epiphany as a kind of unders and overs tin. Remember those from before we had computers and we had to try and balance, don't listen, Derek, when we had to balance the figures at the end of each day. With Christmas occurring on a fixed date, but Easter occurring on the first Sunday after the full moon following the 21st of March, that says something, doesn't it? The numbers of weeks between these two major Christian festivals varies from year to year, as we know. And Easter Sunday is never any earlier than March 22nd and cannot be any later than April 25. So the number of Sundays, the length of Epiphany, depends on the number of Sundays in between January and whatever the date of Easter is that year. This year, Easter is relatively early, April 4, so we have just 6 Sundays during Epiphany. Whether Epiphany is longer or shorter, it has the same theme, which is hinted at in its name, Epiphany. And Epiphany is an ancient Greek word. For that matter, it's probably a modern Greek word that means revelation or manifestation or uncovering, if you like. So we're invited to spend the weeks between Christmas and Ash Wednesday reflecting on the ways in which we know God, or if you prefer, the ways in which God makes herself known to us. And it does feel a bit different depending on which way you say that statement. The big idea of Epiphany is that God is made known to us in the person of Jesus. How he lived his life, the things he said, and the way that he died is the great epiphany, the eye-opening, the insight, the supreme revelation, at least for those of us who are Christians. We don't have any need to deny that God can be known through other historical figures or through different sacred texts or through different religious practices. We simply affirm the truth that we do know that is true for us, which is simply this: in Jesus we see God, and in Jesus we see our better selves. That's what we celebrated on Epiphany, the Feast of the Three Kings. And in that legend of the Magi coming, we recognize that in that biblical story, people who are outside the rules, people who under the rules of the Old Testament should have been condemned and possibly even put to death, could still be welcomed. They could understand that God was doing something, and they could respond to God in their own way. And if the Christ child accepted the adoration of the Magi, who are we to say that everybody has to believe the same as we do in order to know God's blessing in their lives, and indeed beyond this life? Last weekend we celebrated the baptism of Jesus, the first Sunday after the Epiphany. We celebrate it as the baptism of Jesus. And in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, that event, the baptism of Jesus, is known as the Great Theophany. Theophany is another Greek word like Epiphany, but it means the revelation of God rather than simply the revelation. And indeed, in the Greek tradition, the icons of the baptism of Jesus are simply called theophany. This is the moment when we see God among us. Now, there are many ways to understand the significance of Jesus' baptism, and we see that as early as the New Testament, because each of the four Gospels kind of deals with the baptism in slightly different ways, trying to come to terms with the core question, why on earth is Jesus getting baptized by him? What's going on here? That was the basic problem for the Gospel writers, and Camelia talked a little bit about that last week. And you can see the diversity these days very easily by going online and watching a selection of sermons from last Sunday, because clergy all around the country are now live streaming their services, and in particular their sermons. So we can look back and see how different places, different clergy, even the same priest in a different year will see the baptism of Jesus slightly differently. So as we tease out the significance of this Epiphany season for us, I want to offer one brief extra comment on the baptism of Jesus. It's actually an unusual moment in the Gospels. Normally, Jesus is the one in charge. He's the one doing something. He's the one saying something, healing somebody, winning an argument with somebody. But the baptism of Jesus is where we actually observe Jesus himself having a religious experience. And that's unusual in the Gospels. He's participating in a religious ritual being administered by somebody else. He's not in charge of the baptism service. Okay? John is. And he's experiencing a moment of revelation, an epiphany, when his identity as a beloved child of God was affirmed and renewed. American scholar who's a friend of mine commented, "The evidence is clear that something profound happened within Jesus at his baptism, which provided direction and energy for a ministry of teaching and healing. Without Jesus' baptism, there might have been no ministry, no getting into trouble with the authorities, no crucifixion, no resurrection, no church, no Christianity, and no church history. And the whole course of human civilization would have gone quite differently." This is not a day for me to preach a sermon about the baptism of Jesus. Camelia did a fine job of that last week. But let me draw your attention to one other little snippet that we can easily overlook, the theme of the voice from heaven. In the Jewish tradition, they call this the bat kol, which technically means daughter of the voice. But it's really a euphemism for the voice of God. Okay, the bat kol. So as we think about the baptism and Jesus hearing a voice from heaven, we ask ourselves, was Jesus the only person in the world to hear the bat kol? I don't mean that day, but through history. And of course the answer is no. Second question is, do we hear the bat kol? Do we hear the voice of God in our own lives? And if we had time, I'd love to go around the cathedral with a roving mic and ask each of you to tell us in 10 or 15 words, one moment, one time when you sensed the voice of God speaking to you. The third question, and we'll come back to this at the end, is whether the way we practice our faith actually assists people to discern the voice of God for themselves. Are we all people in a sacred conversation of God, or do we think of that as something that only happens to special people? And that's where the first reading from this morning comes in. It's a classic story of somebody hearing the bat kol, the voice of God. Samuel's only a child, not even a 12-year-old boy who was seen as being responsible for his own behavior. He's not yet been fully trained in the ways of a priest. Sleeping in a room nearby is the priest in charge of the temple of God at Shiloh, Eli, and that word means my God. While never called the high priest, that's really the role Eli had. Eli was somebody well trained in the ways of religion. The voice of God comes to Samuel, not Eli. And in that, but notice also, as we heard in that story, Eli eventually realizes what's going on, and he's able to coach Samuel into, okay, I think maybe God's trying to talk to you. This is what you need to do next. Okay. So Samuel goes back to his room. It's a classic story, like the three little pigs. There's 3 times that he goes in to wake up Eli. It's a classic oral story. But in that interaction between God, Samuel, and Eli is the very essence of Epiphany. The voice of God does not come just to the Dean of Grafton or to the Bishop of Grafton. It can come to any of us at any time, and we will never be ready for it. On the other hand, we all share the obligation of assisting each other to be ready to hear the voice and to recognize the voice when it happens and to know how best to respond. In other words, Christianity is not a spectator event. You do not gather in the cathedral to observe the sanctity of the Dean and to bask in my reflected holiness. Let's face it, most Sundays you would not need sunglasses, okay? Rather, we gather here, we gather around the scriptures, and we gather around the table of Jesus to help each other learn how to listen to what the Spirit is saying to the church, to explore together how best we might respond to that, and to help each other be faithful as we live into that response which God has laid on our hearts. I'm not your spiritual champion, but I am your coach, and you're my coaches. And in this room right now, seriously, we have hundreds of years of experience in listening to God. Hundreds of years. Let's add up everybody's age in the room. We have hundreds of years of experience right here, gathered in this space this morning. That is an incredible spiritual asset for each other and for Grafton. So that's something we share together. We're all coaches and we're all players. We're a busload of playing coaches. How well we help each other listen to God will be the ultimate test of our success as the people of God in Grafton Cathedral. We don't come here for the fine music, fine though it is. We don't come here for the beautiful liturgies, beautiful though we hope they are, or even for the thoughtful sermons. We try to do all those things well every week, but only because if we can do that reasonably well, we will be people who learn to listen for the voice of God, and we will be people helping each other make sense of it. What did you think God was saying today? What I think God's saying to me is, how can I help you do that this week? Nothing else matters. Not the number of people sitting in the chairs, not the number of people joining us online, not the amount of money in the offering plate. The only thing that matters is that each of us becomes as expert as we can be in listening to God. Nothing else matters. Notice in the gospel reading how this message of direct religious experience is reinforced for us in that story of Nathanael. And it's one of my favourite stories. It mentions Bethsaida and Nazareth in the same paragraph. Hey, it doesn't get any better for this little doggy, okay? So Nathanael is skeptical that anything good could ever come out of Nazareth. He might want to eat his words a couple of thousand years later, but never mind. And Philip, who was from Bethsaida, says to him, come and see. Like, come and find out for yourself. Let's not have an argument about it. Come and see. Come and taste it for yourself. And when Nathanael does come to see, Jesus says to him, do you believe because I said I saw you under the fig tree, you will see greater things than these. You will see heaven opened. You will see the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Nathanael, Nate, you're going to know this firsthand. It's not just something you've heard about. It's something you've experienced yourself. Come and see. Listen for the voice of God. Know God in your own experience. And just imagine if word went around Grafton that people who come to the cathedral learn how to listen to God speaking to them. Amen.